You wake up, and the first thought isn't about the day ahead. It's the same question that's been there every morning for months. What did I do wrong? It doesn't matter whether the marriage ended through slow distance or sudden rupture. For many people navigating divorce at 50, the dominant psychological experience in the aftermath isn't anger or relief, or even grief in its clearest form. It's self-blame, persistent, circular, and remarkably resistant to reason. This is what that looks like, and what research tells us about why it happens, and how it eventually lifts. When a marriage ends after 2 or 3 decades, the loss is rarely singular. Researchers who study late-life divorce describe it as a compound loss, the relationship itself, but also the daily structure built around it, the shared identity, the version of the future both people had assumed. When that much disappears at once, the mind searches for a cause, and in the absence of a clear external explanation, it frequently turns inward. Psychologists refer to this as self-attributional thinking, the tendency, particularly after significant failure, to locate the source of the problem within oneself. It's a predictable cognitive response, but it's not necessarily an accurate one. Studies on the psychological aftermath of long-term marriage dissolution show that people who did not initiate the divorce, those who were surprised by the separation, face a measurably higher risk of prolonged self-blame and clinical depression. The experience of being left activates attachment wounds that can predate the marriage entirely, and the divorce becomes confirmation of a fear that was already there, that they were never quite enough. What receives less attention is the parallel experience of those who did initiate the divorce. Guilt in this group is common and often severe. Guilt over the impact on children, over ending something that once held real meaning, over the perception of having failed at commitment. The direction of blame differs. The psychological weight of it is largely the same. At 50, there's an added dimension that younger people going through separation don't face with the same intensity. Time becomes part of the calculus. At 30, the internal sense of available time provides a buffer. At 50, that buffer has narrowed and the mind registers it. The self-blame acquires a temporal edge. Not just I failed, but I failed, and now it may be too late. That perception is worth examining carefully because it tends to distort both the assessment of the past and the evaluation of what remains possible. If you're finding value in this, take a second to subscribe and leave a like. It helps this kind of content reach people who need it. Mental health researchers have identified rumination as the primary mechanism through which self-blame sustains itself after divorce. Rumination is the repetitive mental replaying of painful events and unresolved questions. The same conversation revisited from a different angle, the same moment examined again for what could have been done differently. It functions like analysis but produces none of analysis's benefits. The clinical evidence on this is consistent. Rumination does not accelerate grief processing, it prolongs it. Each return to the same memory or question reinforces the neural pathways associated with distress rather than resolving them. And self-blame is particularly effective at generating the kind of unanswerable questions that keep rumination active. Questions like, why didn't I see this coming, or what was fundamentally wrong with me, have no satisfying answer. So the search continues, and the search itself becomes the source of ongoing suffering. For older divorced adults, this dynamic carries specific risks. Research on mental health outcomes in this population shows significantly elevated rates of depression, anxiety, and social isolation compared to married peers of the same age. Isolation, in turn, creates the conditions in which rumination intensifies. Without external engagement, without people, obligations, or environments that interrupt the internal loop, the mind defaults to what it has been rehearsing. And what it has been rehearsing, for someone caught in self-blame, tends to be a case against themselves. This is a predictable psychological sequence, not a character assessment. Understanding the mechanism doesn't eliminate it, but it does change the relationship to it. Therapists who specialize in divorce recovery draw a consistent distinction between accountability and self-punishment. Honest acknowledgement of one's contribution to a relationship's failure is considered part of healthy processing. It's specific, proportional, and oriented toward understanding. Self-blame, by contrast, tends to be global, disproportionate, and oriented toward verdict. The clinical language for this shift is moving from a verdict to a narrative. A verdict assigns guilt and closes the case. A narrative examines what actually happened, the accumulated patterns, the unspoken distances, the choices made by two people over many years, without requiring a single responsible party. Most long marriages that end do so through processes that both people participated in, even when the participation was unequal or largely unconscious. Holding that complexity doesn't mean avoiding responsibility. It means placing individual responsibility within a more accurate context. And that shift from "I am the reason this failed" to "this is what happened between two people over time" is where the self-blame typically begins to loosen. The second dimension of recovery that appears consistently in the research involves identity reconstruction. In long marriages, personal identity and relational identity tend to merge gradually. The individual becomes difficult to separate from the couple. When the marriage ends, this creates a specific form of disorientation, not just loss of a partner, but loss of the self-concept that was organized around the partnership. Self-blame moves into that empty space, partly because guilt, however painful, is still an identity. It still tells you who you are. Rebuilding means tolerating the uncertainty of that space long enough to begin answering a different question. Not what did I do wrong, but who am I outside of this relationship? Research on post-divorce recovery in midlife adults identifies two factors that most reliably predict better long-term psychological outcomes: access to consistent social support and engagement in activities that build a new sense of self. People who remain connected to others and who invest in new areas of life recover more completely, on average, than those who withdraw and ruminate. This dynamic explains part of why self-blame is so functionally damaging beyond the suffering it causes directly. It promotes the exact conditions that make recovery harder. Guilt encourages concealment and withdrawal. The belief that one is fundamentally at fault discourages new investment because failure feels like a foregone conclusion. The result is a behavioral pattern: isolation, passivity, repetitive self-examination that perpetuates the very state it emerged from. Interrupting that pattern rarely begins with resolution. It more often begins with a small, concrete change in behavior, a conversation with someone capable of genuine listening, a commitment to a single activity outside the grief, engagement with a therapist who works with life transitions. These are not dramatic interventions. They are the kinds of incremental interruptions that over time create enough distance from the self-blame loop to allow other things to enter. Divorce at 50 is, by most psychological measures, one of the more demanding transitions an adult can navigate. The losses are real and numerous, the grief is legitimate, and the self-blame that accompanies it is, in most cases, a distortion. A mind under significant stress, assigning coherent cause to something that was far more complex than any single person's failure. The research on this is not ambiguous. People who recover most fully are not those who successfully prove they weren't at fault. They are those who develop the capacity to hold accountability and self-worth simultaneously, to acknowledge what was theirs without making it the entirety of the story. The past isn't a case to be won or lost. It's a period that ended. What continues is the present and what happens in it. Mambisiya. If this video reflected something you've been living through, leave a comment below. Whether you're in the middle of it, years out, or somewhere in between, your experience matters, and so does the conversation around it. Subscribe if you haven't yet. There's more ahead. The next video examines why so many people feel a profound sense of shame after a late-life divorce, where that shame actually comes from, and what it takes to move through it. It's a subject that doesn't get enough serious attention. We'll give it that.